A great way to get started with scale modelling is through the purchase and completion of a starter set. And if you're into tanks, there may be one for you. Previously, I looked at the Airfix Tiger 1 in 1/72nd scale, and to go along with it, I also did the Sherman in 1/72nd scale. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I complete a kind of back to basics build of the Airfix Sherman Firefly in 1/72nd scale. Let's get this down onto the workbench. So just like I did with the Tiger video, I'm going to do this one in two parts. The first part will be a kind of out of the box kind of basic build where I do things more or less in a similar way that a starter or a beginner might have access to in their modelling kind of time. The second part I'll just be adding a few extra bits and pieces to further improve the model, which again beginners may be able to progress onto. So with that in mind, I'm going to pop a list of all the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this kit for yourself. It does come with paints and glues because it's a starter set, but as mentioned in my unboxing video, unfortunately not all of mine were completely usable. That's partly down to the fact that this has been sitting in my stash for nearly 5 years, but also there was a problem with the Humble Pot design around 2020 when this was released. The paints were drying out and unfortunately meant that they were not usable. If you did have unusable paints in your kit though, you could always contact the Airfix spares department for a spare, return it to your retailer, or try and source an alternative for yourself. So as is quite typical with my builds, I'm going to snip all the various parts away from the sprue using my side cutters and then clean up any flash or extra bits of plastic using a sanding stick. Fortunately though, as this is a 2020 tooling, it doesn't really feature anything in the way of flash. This kit does come with a tube of poly cement, so why not use this for this part of the build? The instructions actually tell you where to place the cement, so I'm just going to put the cement in the relevant places. I do decide to do it straight out of the tube, but for more accuracy you could apply it with a toothpick or a piece of wire just so you get it in the exact spot. The first part of this was to build up the main hull of the tank. This was a rather simple affair and builds up very much like a box. All the parts are designed really well and almost snap together. With the lower half of the hull done, I turn my attention to the upper half. There are some smaller details which have to be glued in from the inside. I believe that these are tie down points, and I was careful to install them using my tweezers, as I could imagine this being quite fiddly if I was to use my fingers. With that done, I glued into place the rear of the tank, and then added some of the smaller details which are included to the outside of the hull. There is a hull machine gun included in this kit, which is a questionable design choice, as in real life many Fireflies had this removed. But with that done, I glued the top of the hull onto the lower part of the chassis. Now I can turn my attention to the turret. And just as with the Tiger, if you assemble this correctly, you should have a barrel of your gun which can traverse freely. I did have to take care of my glue here to see if this was a reasonable kind of expectation. With that done, I finished off the assembly of the turret by installing the rotating ring, and then added the end of the barrel. Airfix have designed it in this way so that you don't have to drill out your barrels as you would have done with older kits. And it's at this point pretty much everything is assembled. You'll notice that I have the tracks here, they just come as single pieces. Everything will be joined together after the next step. And what is this step, you might be wondering? Well, it is time to prime. I got it on a t-shirt. Someone said, oh, you should put that on a t-shirt, so I have. You can get them online there's a link underneath, I think. And to spray this, I'm going to be using some Humbrol No. 1 Grey Primer. This can is on its last legs now, but I think I'll have enough in here to just finish off this kit. I did this outside because it was a nice day, and a couple of thin coats would be applied to all these parts. With that done, the next paint to be used was this Vallejo Russian uniform colour. I would have used the included paint in the set, but as mentioned, mine were not in a usable condition. I would apply a thin coat of this paint. I have added a drop of water, and I mean like a literal drop, just to help with the flow. And I used a medium-sized brush to apply it to the entire model of the tank. That primer that I've already put down should act as a key to help this paint stick to the plastic and not be tempted to peel off or chip after it's dried. I did end up actually only needing one coat of this green paint, as it's a relatively dark colour, and I find that darker colours tend to have fairly good opacity. So this step didn't actually take very long to do at all. Next up is some gunmetal grey. This was painted onto the tracks. I did this using a finer brush to try and avoid getting it in the wrong places and ruining that green paint I've already applied. I'd also used this on a couple of smaller details dotted around the tank, such as that hull machine gun and some of the other tools which are stowed on the hull. Next, some Vallejo black was used to carefully paint the rims on the running wheels. This was a much easier step to complete on this tank as compared to the Tiger. The Tiger I built previously has a much more complicated running gear. This one has more open space, so is easier to complete. And now it's time to move on to all of the decals. A single sheet of decals is provided and they're printed by cartograph, so they are to a very high quality. The whole sheet was dipped into some warm water to help release them from the backing paper. Humbrol Decal Fix will be my setting solution of choice in this part of the build. If you haven't got a setting solution like this, you could just use water, but Decal Fix will help soften them onto the surface and appear painted on. The first thing to do was to apply some of this Decal Fix to the areas the transfers were going to go. The decals were then slid into place and carefully positioned. Once the decals had started to cure, some more Decal Fix would be applied over the top to further soften them. What this setting solution is going to do is to help avoid any clear parts of the decal film from leaving a silver-like appearance. It should also soften the decals onto the surface of the model and make them appear as though these markings are painted on, rather than just kind of stickers. As there aren't that many decals included in the set, this wasn't a particularly long step either. It is worth noting that there are a couple more decals in this kit than compared to the Tiger. And the decals cured, you can see that the Decal Fix has left a slightly glossy sheen in a few places. I don't want that to remain on the finish of the model, so I'm going to cover the entire tank with some of this Humbrol Clear Matte Varnish. It's not as matte as I would like it to be, but it will do the job and even out the finish of the tank. This was applied straight from the bottle using a paintbrush and painted over the entire tank. This is also going to help protect those decals and act a bit like another layer of glue just holding them in place. Once that clear matte varnish was painted on and now dry, I glued the tracks onto the side of the tank. I had to be super careful with my glue here just to make sure I didn't get it in the wrong places and ruin the paintwork I've already applied. And with the tracks added, I then popped into place the turret. I won't glue it in though, because I would like to have it be able to rotate freely. And for part 1 of this build, that's pretty much it. This kit is now finished to a kind of out of the box standard, in a kind of way that a beginner may have access to. Granted, you might not have a decal setting solution, so you could just settle for water. You may not have a primer. You could paint straight onto the plastic. You may not have a clear matte varnish, so you could skip that step. But this varnish will help protect those decals and anything that we do in part 2. But I think realistically this is kind of the basic look that the tank might look like by the time you finish building it. So let's move on to part 2 and just add a few extra bits and pieces to improve the look of this tank a little bit. So first up, I've got some of this Humbrol Rust wash. It's a enamel based kind of wash. And all I did with this was apply it to the running gear, the tracks, and some of the lower surfaces of the tank to give a slightly dirty and worn kind of look. Perhaps some paint has chipped away and it's become a little bit rusty. Once that was done, I thinned down some of that Vallejo black paint that we used earlier with some tap water. What I'm doing here is creating a very thin paint, otherwise known as a wash, and this was then brushed over the entire tank. You could add a drop of washing up liquid to this mix just to help with the flow. This wash should help bring out all of those details, adding a layer of contrast and making the tank look a little bit more dirty. With that done, I moved on to this Humbrol No. 1 Grey Primer. I applied some of this paint to my brush and then removed it again, because I want my brush to feel as though it's dry. This is a technique called dry brushing. And provided of course my tank is also dry, with no wet paint on it, when I apply this brush over the tank, that grey paint should stick only to the raised details, adding a further contrast or highlight. It can also give a slightly worn effect to the paintwork. With that dry brushing complete, I thought I would muddy up the tank a little bit. Here I've got some Green Stuff World mud texture. This is a dark brown mud which was given to me by my wife as a gift a couple of years ago, and I thought I'd like to give it a try on this tank. This is a rather thick kind of texture paint. All I did with this was put it on my paintbrush and apply it to all the various areas of the tank which I think may have accumulated mud as it was driving through the countryside. So the tracks, the lower side of the running gear, and the lower side of the body of the tank. Perhaps some other areas on the sides as well where it's being sort of picked up and deposited. As it's a texture paint, it should look a bit like mud when it dries. I do want to add some aerials to this kit as well, so I've taken some of the sprue from the kit. These are the bits the kit was being held onto. I heated it up and then stretched it into a fine wire. These fine wires were then cut to suitable length and then carefully glued into place where the radio antenna would have been on the Sherman. They were still a little bit long, so after the glue had started to cure, I cut them to a more appropriate length based on what I'd seen in images online. And then to hide the fact that these are just bits of plastic, I gave them a quick coat of that gunmetal paint which I used previously. With that done, I reassembled the turret onto the tank, and I think at this point I can call my project complete. And there we have it, one sort of back to basics kind of build of the Airfix Sherman Firefly in 1/72 scale. So as usual, I've kept all of my notes in my logbook, and I've had a look through, and on the whole it says it's a relatively nice kit. The details are pretty crisp. It's perfect for further improvements if you want to get one of these relatively cheaply and just want to mess around with it. Absolutely fantastic for that. Unfortunately, I did mention that the paints were not usable and I did have to throw them away, which is a bit of a disappointment, especially if this is like your first experience of a starter set. On the positive side, I did write down that the main assembly of the build only took 45 minutes, so this is not a overly complicated kit and you can make quite quick progress with it. Of course, as mentioned, there may be some detail inaccuracies with the fact that this has got a hull machine gun, which Fireflies, I'm led to believe, didn't have that. They needed the extra space inside the hull for the size of the weapon and storing parts and ammunition and things. There is another version of this kit out there, just like with the Tiger 1. There is a second version which has more parts and more complicated tracks. And someone has mentioned to me that that includes a blanking plate, but I haven't experienced that kit myself, so I can't confirm that. But yeah, so there is another version of this kit, a non-starter set version, which has more parts and more detailed elements, which I imagine builds up into a really nice representation of the Sherman Firefly with a few extra bits and pieces compared to what we've seen in this build today. So how much did I pay for this kit? Well, as mentioned, this is a 2020 release. Well, I think technically 2021, because of things that were going on, it was a bit delayed. I paid £10.99 for it back then. Today, however, prices have gone up, as they seem to have gone up everywhere, and you would be looking at £11.99 here in the UK at the time I'm making this video. That doesn't seem a particularly bad kind of price for a model kit. You're getting 31 crisply molded parts, you're getting a set of decals from Cartograph, you're also getting paints, cement and a paintbrush, so you are getting almost like the whole package. However, obviously if your paints are no good, do make sure you're contacting Airfix Spares to get a replacement. Fortunately though, I have stuff in the stash which I can use just so I could get this one completed. As always though, if you can find this one cheaper, then it's always going to be a better deal for you. On the whole, I've actually quite enjoyed building this one. It's quite a nice little mojo build, and I did actually find this one to be a little bit more fun than the Tiger that I built previously. But yeah, I think that's probably about it for this video. Let me know what you think of my back to basics kind of build of this Sherman Firefly in the comments below. I'm also open to any suggestions you might have for other kits you'd like to see me build. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our latest member to the club, Martin Keel. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to join these guys on screen or support the channel in other ways, full information is below the video. The best way, of course, to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on, so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, from me at the workbench today, it's a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you again soon. Airfix Sherman Firefly starter set. Take one. A little bit loud still. Maybe I'll just do it here. Maybe I'll do it. It just needs to see the click, doesn't it? Oh, that's magnetic. What this setting solution should do is try and avoid. No. That's got a magnet in. Didn't realise that. I've only had this for like 6 months.